Yes, today Steph and I wanted to concentrate on some of the responsibilities that you have if you're a listing agent or you're going to take a listing, the responsibilities you have with your seller and how to protect your seller, especially in this market. There are a lot of, excuse me, there are a lot of things going along that buyers are asking sellers to do or giving concessions to sellers, and they may seem like great benefits to the seller. But as a listing agent, you really need to be cautious about some of the things you allow your seller to accept or to become a part of. And this was the topic that Steph and I talked about that we were going to present today. And then, as I mentioned, I went into the Legal Update Live. WRA has been doing this series of legal videos on all the different aspects of this competitive market. If you have an opportunity, go to the WRA.org site and look under these legal updates. They're all recorded for you to watch. Many of us weren't able to watch them as they went on live because most of them were on Tuesday mornings at 9 o'clock. But the episodes are great. They're done by the two lawyers at WRA and very short. They're like 20 minutes long. So today I picked out episode 18, and I'm going to play it as part of our contract training today. It takes about 25 minutes, so we have time when it's over for your questions on how it relates to you and questions you might have if you have a listing coming up or if you're in the middle of a listing. So we will get this started, and let's see.
Oh, I can go ahead and play it.
Okay.
I will kick it off then. So thanks, guys.
And as I said, we'll have questions when
Hello,
this is over.
and welcome to episode 18 of our Being Competitive mini-series for our Legal Update Live. This one, we are going to talk about specific seller terms of the offer. And
Is that you or me? I'm not hearing anything. I dropped off.
Well, yeah. You're cool. No, I wouldn't have anyone all the time now, right?
Hey, either we all do this or none of us do. We spend our lives together.
Yeah.
Very
Come
well
on,
put, Professor.
no, come on, I can bow out, you guys can still take them, you know, you can.
Sorry, I can't hear anything.
Joan, are they working on getting the audio?
I don't know. I'm trying to, I thought it was just me at first. I left the meeting to come back in. But
Wait, are you guys unable to hear it?
we can't hear anything.
We can't hear it.
Oh,
No. No, I thought it was just me that my internet had gone out again, but
I'm so sorry.
it started out, so at least we had it.
Okay.
That mean? Well, that's our way of discussing
Are we
sort of the
done?
seller requirements in some of these competitive markets. What are some of the things that we're seeing, trends we're seeing that sellers are establishing for part of the transaction? I'm sure you've all run into this. You're looking at a listing and you see that they're going to restrict showings until a certain date. Okay, that's one trend we're seeing. Or maybe the seller is not going to review offers until a certain date. They say all offers to be reviewed on whatever date. Sometimes they even say a time, so everybody knows, you know, the deadline for them to get offers in. Another trend we're seeing is sellers sometimes restricting financing sources, and we're going to talk more about, you know, pros and cons of that and what to look out for. And then requesting offers without specific contingencies and what that looks and why a seller might be asking for those items. And again, those are just the trends that we're seeing and hearing about. Of course, you may have other examples, so feel free to ask that question if you have something more specific. In terms of what should the agent do, you want to confirm your company policy, check MLS policies, document the request in writing, put the additional provisions in the listing agreement or amend the listing agreement. I'm going to let Corey talk a little bit more about some of what these recommendations are for agents if a seller is requesting these specific terms. Right. So when your seller says, you know, I'm a busy person, I just don't want to have you constantly calling me and telling me, you know, I've got my 40th offer. I want to just be able to have you collect them and give them all to me at the same time. So could we just see those at, you know, this date on Sunday on this time? And in that moment, as an agent, you have that potential to do that, but you want to make sure that you're documenting this so that it's a directive of your seller and not something that you're necessarily suggesting, because that's where we kind of get ourselves into a little bit of trouble. And so if your seller says, these are the requests I have, these are the types of restrictions and limitations I would like to set on the offers that are coming in and when I'm going to review them, you document that in your additional provisions, for example, or in some sort of addendum in your listing contract. If all of a sudden you've already signed your listing contract and now this is all overwhelming them, and because it is a highly competitive market, then at some point they might say, I need parameters. I need to set limitations on people. I need boundaries. And then that moment, you can certainly amend your listing contract. And the goal here, again, is to document that it's their request and document what those terms are in writing. So that if someone accuses you or tries to accuse you of maybe, you know, playing a system, gaming the game, then at that point you can say, nope, that was a directive from my seller. Yeah, reiterating too, maybe make sure you're checking your MLS policies and following along with what their rules are. If a seller is maybe they want the listing delayed or withheld depending on the MLS that you're in. What does that look like? What does the MLS require? And what does that mean in terms of, we could get into a whole conversation about what that means about advertising and what you can and can't do. But definitely check with your MLS policies, because you don't want to be running afoul of those at a request of the seller. You may just have to tell the seller, I can't do what you're asking me to do because of my participation in the MLS and what that requires of me. Right, and Jennifer and I will always tell you, as will any attorney that you're calling through the legal hotline or submitting a question, that if you ask us to interpret an MLS policy or rule, yeah, we're sending you back to that MLS to make sure that they're the ones that are giving you their interpretations. They drafted the rules, they set the restrictions, they understand the goals and the intent behind it. That's not something that we know, and we will stay within our lane, if you will, and we'll make sure that we send you back. I know it's not what you want to hear, but it's just the reality of making sure that you know to go back to your MLS if it's their policy that you're trying to figure out what does it mean and how do I incorporate all this into my my listing. So, I mean, obviously, when you have competitive markets, your sellers have their needs, your buyers have their goals. And so, one of them that Jennifer mentioned early on was this no showings until a particular date, right? And I kind of went through that example of where your seller says, I've got a lot of things going on and I just can't be overwhelmed by every email you're pushing my way of every offer that's being provided, because you're required to promptly present offers, or you're required to have prompt access to the property, or allow access to the property. And so there's like a lot of different reasons that maybe your seller's saying, I just don't want to have any showings. Before, when it was in COVID, that was obvious as to why they were trying to limit some of that. But now it's just the overwhelming kind of nature, maybe, that it is for the seller. It could be that they're trying to, again, limit the inconvenience of having showings, minimize the traffic in their property for the long term. And as well as it could be that they say, look, step back a second. I got some stuff I need to take care of before you actually come in and look at my property, and I want to make some repairs. And so that's why you might see that there's this kind of limitation. But Jennifer, what if the date of the offer hasn't arrived and there's an accepted offer and the buyer wants to write?
Okay, we get this question all the time on the hotline, where from the outside looking in, the property is advertised as no showings until a particular date. July 3rd, whatever. That's the deadline. The seller says, I don't want anybody in the property until July 3rd. For whatever reason, they want to limit traffic. They're trying to maybe condense all the buyers. They want all the buyers to show up at the open house on one day, so all the buyers freak out and want to write an offer because they see all the other buyers that are interested. All sorts of legitimate reasons for that. But then all of a sudden, that date hasn't arrived. So as far as we know, there's been no showings, because it said no showings until July 3rd. But then you look and there's an accepted offer on the property. What happened? Usually from the outside looking in, agents are like, hey, this doesn't look right. It said no showings until the 3rd. And now here it is, the 2nd, and there's an accepted offer even before then. What might have happened? There's a possibility that a buyer wrote an offer sight unseen. The buyers saw it online. They saw what they liked. They saw the pictures. They drove by and they said, let's do it. Let's write the offer sight unseen. Agents can't stop that. There's nothing that they can do. They can't say, oh, seller, the buyer hasn't seen the property yet, so they can't write the offer. That's just not true. A buyer can write an offer sight unseen.
You can't stop free will.
Right.
Gotcha.
Right.
Okay.
You may also have a situation, and this might take us back to our MLS discussion, but maybe the seller said no showings until a certain date, and then here it is, it's a lovely Friday afternoon, and the seller's out doing some gardening, and a potential buyer walks by, and they start chatting, and the seller's like, I'm selling this place. Maybe the yard sign's even up already. And the buyer's like, I'm interested. And the seller says, come on in. And the seller shows the property to the buyer. There's no agents anywhere in this discussion. And the buyer goes and has their attorney write the offer. So nobody was alerted to the fact that the buyer and the seller were not necessarily following along with the seller's initial rule of no showings until a certain date. And there's nothing the listing agent could have done about either of those situations. So even though from the outside looking in, it looks like somebody didn't follow the rules, maybe the seller didn't follow their own rules, or maybe the buyer wrote an offer sight unseen, in which case nothing improper happened.
And if you have more questions about these buyers with sight unseen offers, episode 14 of the competitive mini-series does actually discuss that. So episode 14, if you're wanting to know a little bit more about buyers writing offers without seeing the property, is this last bullet here about sellers showing the property without the agent's knowledge. That can be a little squishy, I guess, or a little uncomfortable. If you're in the MLS and your property is in some certain MLSs, maybe a delayed status, for example, and there's no showings, your seller may have accidentally just violated the MLS rule because they showed that property to the buyer, the prospective buyer. So there's a couple of little bit of educational notes as well with your seller about some of those MLS policies, and then making sure that you talk to your MLS. Once again, talk to your MLS about the interpretation of their policies and restrictions. I think sometimes there's this perception that if the listing contract or the listing out there says no showings until X date, that there is sometimes this idea that the listing agent's trying to maybe secure their own buyer. And so sometimes, though, the agent's not doing anything wrong. As we've indicated, that you have a seller that says, I just don't want to have any showings, or I've got something I need to do. And so from our perspective, it's always best to give the benefit of the doubt, to make sure that maybe the listing agent's just trying to kind of utilize the limitations that their seller has set forth on their behalf.
Yeah, and I think that's important because, like I was trying to emphasize, like from the outside looking in, it looks like maybe something funny happened, but we don't really know the details of whether it was a sight unseen offer or whether the seller showed the property. So I think just best to give the benefit of the doubt and not assume that there was secret showings or the agent was giving some people showings without showings to others. This other trend that we're seeing is offers will be reviewed on a certain date. And there's enough, just like restricting showings, there's a number of reasons why a seller would choose this as a negotiation strategy. In a competitive market, if there's multiple offers that are anticipated, which I think that you all know what's going to happen, you know, when you're looking at a property that's going to be listed, whether you anticipate multiple offers going based on what's going on in the current market, if there's multiple offers that are going to be anticipated, I think it's perfectly reasonable negotiation thought process for a seller to say, I want to see them all at once. And I want to take all of these that have a radon testing contingency, and I don't want to deal with that. And I want to see all the prices next to each other, and I want to see all the closing dates, and I want to see all the contingencies. So they have the best picture of what it looks like from the buyer's perspective in terms of what the buyers are willing to offer the seller for that property. Additionally, by saying, let's collect them all and then review them all together, the seller is in possibly the best position to not feel compelled to take the first offer that comes along. You know, it's like if you were picking sides for a sports team, you wouldn't want to say, you know, kick that soccer ball for me and then I'll decide yes or no if I'm going to pick you. I want to see you all kick that soccer ball and then decide whether I want to pick you and put you on my team. So it takes the pressure off the seller to accept the first thing that comes along when something better might be coming, and then have them all available for evaluation at one time from the seller's perspective. I certainly, if I was in this situation where I was selling my house and I knew it was a competitive market, this would be my preference, would be to review all the offers at once. So I really know what I'm dealing with, and I'm just going to set aside that time and do my homework and diligently work through it and figure out what's going to be best for me in my situation.
I would agree. In perfect world, and Jennifer and I get to live in these perfect worlds in these moments. As a seller, that's what I would want. I think it might be also because we're both a little, just maybe a little controlling and a little type A. And besides the fact that we have a legal background, we both probably like the idea of laying them all out and piecemealing them and seeing what we like and what we don't like. In addition, I think it does give the seller the best opportunity to engage in multiple counter proposals, so they can say, okay, as Jennifer indicated, maybe these are already off the table, or I'll secondary offer those, but these 5, I really like the idea of sending a multiple counter proposal. And so if you have them all just coming in randomly, you don't get to see the world maybe in that same scope. And so I can understand from a seller's perspective why they want that. And it allows them to evaluate whether they should just do the, hey, highest and best, depending on what comes in. And if you're like, wait, I have a question about, escalation clauses. Yeah, that's a different competitive offer mini series that Debbie Conrad and Tracy Ruck are going to be talking to you about. So go find that one, and they can build on all those conversations about escalation clauses. Because from my perspective as a seller, I love the idea of getting them all in, and rather than having a various level of different kind of escalation clauses, I like that, you got to write your highest and best, because I just can't. I can't deal with this. And so it gives an opportunity again for the seller to collect them all and then be able to kind of lay them out and do a compare and contrast. And honestly, it does allow you as an agent, because you have to give I always say the advantages, disadvantages, the pluses and minuses. That's your obligation when you present. It allows it to be much easier to kind of do them all at one time. And so, again, those are reasons that you tend to see it from a seller's perspective.
Yeah, being able to methodically work through them. And going to Corey's point about the multiple counter proposals, the seller's going to know what terms they want to put in those multiple counter proposals based on what they've already seen people are willing to give. So they know kind of where the target points are, where they want to try to keep negotiating with those certain buyers. So another part of it, go ahead.
No, I was going to ask you, but Jennifer, the date for reviewing those offers hasn't arrived, and there's an accepted offer. What the heck?
Yeah, so this is similar to our discussion of no showings until a certain date, and then magically there's an accepted offer before that date. What happens here? It says the seller's going to review all offers on Friday, whatever that date is, and all of a sudden here it is Wednesday, and there's an accepted offer. And you're like, well, wait a minute, how did that happen? I thought the seller was going to review all offers on a certain date. Couple of ways that can happen. One way is that the buyer wrote an offer. The buyer said, all right, seller, you're telling me you're going to review all offers on a certain date. I'm going to push you a little bit on that. And I'm going to submit a great offer that's shiny and pretty and it's lovely, but I'm going to make the date for binding acceptance before the date that you're going to review it. So I'm going to cause you to be under a little bit of pressure, seller. Do you want to lose this offer and have me go away if you're going to wait until that date? Or do you want to jump and accept it? So again, if it shows up with an accepted offer prior to the date when they're going to review them, it's possible that the buyer said, let me see how serious the seller is about reviewing all those offers on a certain date and see if I can get them to stray a little bit from that policy.
I can't imagine buyers are that aggressive in this competitive market, but they are. And I don't think that Jennifer and I are surprised by this. We probably would fall into that category of, oh, you know what? Here's one thing we could do as a buyer. But I think as an agent, as a listing agent, so you have the circumstance, your seller has said, they have given you, and we would say written direction, that you're going to review all these offers on a certain date. And now this crafty, competitive, aggressive buyer has said, oh, I got it. So you're going to see everything on Tuesday. Well, I'm going to put my binding acceptance on Monday. And so now you have to figure out what's next. So if you are this listing agent, you've had this direction from your seller, you've had this conversation. Did you have that part of the conversation, that discussion about, well, what happens? What do you want me to do if you said everything on Tuesday, but someone comes in and has their contract with a binding acceptance before Tuesday? What would you like me to do? Tell them that, nope, it's till Tuesday, or do you want me to call you and let you know that it's come in? If you've done that, then at least you've had a conversation. If you've been silent about that, then the argument I would say is that you have to present. And so that's where it can get you to be a little bit of a difficult position. And obviously what's going to happen for you is your seller says, I love that contract. I don't need to see anything else. I accept. And boom. Now all the other agents say, what the heck? What have you done? You're so shady. And you're like, no, I promised you, this wasn't me. And I think that that's, again, we're pretending that or configuring that these are the things that are happening behind the scenes. Obviously, some people maybe are gaming the system, and that's a different conversation. But I think that's the challenge, of course, that we're seeing. So I think that some of this conversation does depend on kind of what your conversation was with the seller, but documenting that is certainly going to provide a little bit of a refresher for them when these things do occur.
And I think it's important when you're listing that property, if you're having this conversation with the seller where your seller is Corey or myself, and we want to see all the offers all at once, or no showings until a certain date. You say, okay, seller, if an offer comes in with a date before binding acceptance, and what do you want me to do with that? Do you want me to just say, not tell you about it? Do you want me to not present it? Because as we said before, you have to present all offers unless contrary to the instructions of your party. I think it comes in the listing offer with a date that it doesn't say not to present offers. Let's say that the agent didn't have that conversation, like Corey was saying. We said no offers until a certain date, but nothing was documented in the listing contract. Corey might have a different opinion than me on this, but I think at a minimum, you'd have to communicate with your seller that an offer did come in that has a date for binding acceptance. And you say, what do you want me to do, seller? I know you said no offers or all offers to be reviewed by this date, but I'm just giving you a heads up. This offer came in with a date for binding acceptance before that. What do you want me to do?
So I think the hardest part is, so if the circumstances existed that Jennifer and I keep kind of coming at you about, where the offers are not going to be reviewed until a certain date, and there's an accepted offer that happens before that deadline or that date has hit, did the listing agent do anything necessarily wrong?
Not necessarily.
You never know.
Yeah, it could be that the seller's breaking their own rules. They may have said, at the outset, they said, don't show me any offers until a certain date. And then something comes along with that date for binding acceptance, or the agent communicates to them, and the seller's like, my rules, I get to break them. I'm going to accept that offer anyway. And all of a sudden it goes to an accepted offer.
I mean, if it's a true cash offer, $100,000 above list, I'm thinking, yeah, it's coming in. Yeah, the outlook is good for me. So, I mean, again, it all depends as a seller. To Jennifer's comment, they might be breaking their own rules, and as agents, there's only so much we can do because statutes and rules, primarily, especially license law, only apply to real estate licensees, and we don't regulate the behavior of buyers and sellers. And so that's where sometimes it may frustrate you, but at the same time, it's kind of the reality. Now, again, we know that there are certain circumstances where maybe there are those, it's been suggested, are gaming a system. That's a different discussion. But this is talking about when your seller has directed you to basically have these offers received on a certain date. The other circumstance that we see are the sellers saying, oh, I also want to restrict your financing sources. So they'll say, you know what, I really don't want to have VA financing. I've done this before. I don't love the extra, steps my property has to go through. And so, Jennifer, as a seller, could I potentially say no VA financing?
Well, I mean, a seller could, but the big concern with that is that veterans are a protected class in some, depending on where you are in the state, they are not a protected class at the state or federal level, but it could be a protected class locally. So if a seller says, don't show me any offers contingent on a VA financing, is that discriminating against that veteran because of their veteran status? I think there's an argument there that it is, and that seller and potentially the listing agent, if they're going along with that, could be running afoul of some fair housing classes, or running afoul of some fair housing rules where they would be discriminating based on veteran status.
Right. I think that's always a good reminder. As Jennifer indicated, you could have local units of government that have added to their protected classes. So, you have your federal, you have your state, and then you have your local. And so you do have to be sensitive to that, especially if you practice in more than one community. You want to make sure that you understand they could be adding to their protected classes. And so you have to be sensitive to that. And if you are like, wait, I have a question about a Dear Seller letter, or it's a love letter, depending on how maybe you've referred to it. There's another legal update for that one as well. So in our Being Competitive mini-series that Debbie Conrad and Tracy Rocca are doing, I believe that's episode 13. So we do have, we recognize that there are lots of different things that are coming at you in this competitive marketplace. But this financing sources, we have been hearing this is a conversation, and it's been happening now for a little over a year, I would say. And so we just want you to be mindful of the fact that it's something about it makes you feel uncomfortable from our perspective. But certainly if there's a protected class, a veteran that's listed as a protected class in your local area, then that's something that you have to talk about. What are other ways that they might be dealing with financing restrictions?
Restricting financing, we often will see where they want to restrict it because, based on the source, we already dealt with veterans. Maybe it's FHA financing. They want to have some restriction on that, realizing that that's boxing out a whole lot of potential buyers from that source who might be writing great offers. So consider that discussion with the seller, that do they really want to limit the competition in that way when that limitation might be depriving them of what could be the best offer for that individual. Caution too, if a seller, let's say a seller wants to restrict it and say not from this loan source or only from this loan source, it's super important for everyone to acknowledge it, that they have to modify the offer to purchase for that to be effective, because the language in the offer to purchase says that the buyer can satisfy the financing commitment contingency by delivering a loan commitment for the loan described in the offer or any other loan acceptable to the buyer. So when a buyer drafts their financing commitment contingency and they name a source or they describe their loan, that's great. If they get a loan commitment for that loan, they can satisfy the financing commitment contingency with that, or the lender might offer them something different that they can live with, or a different source might offer them some lending that they can live with, and they can deliver the loan commitment for that loan and satisfy financing that way. So if a seller wants to lock it down and restrict it, they have to modify the offer, whether it be, this kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier, is it in the listing contract if the seller indicates that to their listing agent and then they communicate that to other agents. It might not be necessary to counter that offer if it comes in citing that loan source or whatever it is that the seller doesn't want to address. They may have to counter it to get rid of that language.
Right. And we did provide you a couple of examples of maybe what that verbiage could look like, provided to you on the slide. Jennifer, in addition, could you provide, there's a couple more, like a few little extra steps that we talk about with restricting financing sources?
In this discussion, looking at if the buyer names a financing source, let's say, keep it broad and say the buyer writes their offer contingent on conventional financing and the seller says, I want conventional only, I don't want FHA. Then the offer would perhaps be modified to get rid of or another loan acceptable to the buyer so that it's only conventional financing. And there's a magazine article, I'm going to forget what month, but it was in maybe April of 2021, we were discussing what this looks like when the buyer switches financing halfway down the road. They put conventional and all of a sudden they're delivering an FHA loan commitment, and the seller's like, what happened? You said conventional. It's because of that language in the offer where the buyer can say, or any other loan acceptable to the buyer. So if the seller wants to lock it down, the offer would have to be modified to delete another loan acceptable to the buyer, and then the buyer's got one source and one source only that they can use.
And then we move on to a little bit of a different discussion. Sometimes you just have a seller that says, I don't want this, or this. In that circumstance, some of the more common ones that we see, the seller says, yeah, I don't want your offer to be contingent on the fact that you have to sell your property to buy mine. And that's kind of a big deal for a buyer if they're not independently wealthy, to say, oh, you know what, I'm just going to, not write my offer, even though I have to sell my house to buy your house. But some sellers really dig that because that obviously doesn't slow the process, maybe because, granted, if it's a competitive market in both places, you're not probably worried about it the same way. But definitely something that a lot of sellers start to like, I don't want your property to be a drag on mine. Another one that we have is a no appraisal contingency offer. They don't want to see those. That is something that, again, you're going to find out in a different legal update live about what that conversation looks like. You also see no testing contingency or no inspection contingency. And Jennifer and I have actually done episode 16 of this competitive mini series, talking about the fact that what it looks like when a buyer says no inspection contingency. Because in both the testing and inspection, you actually have a buyer that says, you know what, I'm good with whatever the condition of the property is because I'm not going to have anybody else educate me about it. So that's something that, we would always highlight a concern about. So I encourage you to look at that one.
We've kind of been hitting on this idea as we've been going throughout this. And we said at the beginning, the title of this was seller specific terms of the offer, which doesn't necessarily tell you a whole lot about where we were going with that idea. But it's from the seller's perspective where they're like, I'm going to shut down certain avenues, whether it's financing or these contingencies that I don't want to see, or no showings until a particular date, whatever the case is. When a seller is putting those restrictions on the listing firm, ideally, they are in the listing contract. And even better is get them as non-confidential information so that they can be disclosed. And we always tend to interpret things conservatively. Like you might think, well, the seller told me no showings until a particular date, so there's no reason I can't put that out there. I'm of the opinion that the safest thing is to identify that as non-confidential information, so you and the seller are seeing eye to eye that this is going to be disclosed to the public. If it was something like a seller said no testing or inspection contingencies, and the seller said that's non-confidential information, that's going to raise red flags for buyers and be like, why can't I have testing inspection contingencies? What's going on there? Seller, what's buried in that backyard, right? What am I going to test for and fine? If it's identified as non-confidential information, great. You can shout it from the rooftops, disclose it to your other agents in the private remarks. If something comes in where, let's say it was the seller doesn't want an appraisal contingency, because we all know what's going on right now where buyers are maybe offering over list price, and sometimes the appraisal doesn't quite match that. If a seller says, let's just, call that out, and an offer comes in that's contingent on the appraisal, as we said before, obviously you have to present that to your seller and point that out as like, you didn't want this seller. Do you want to accept it as is? If not, we can counter it and ask for the buyer to remove that contingency. So counter to clean up those items.
And of course, there are other things out there, right? Like the seller says, and this has been something we've talked about for years, not just like they want a specific financing source or they don't want certain contingencies, but it also could be, I want a certain amount of earnest money. I want that earnest money to be non-refundable. So there's lots of interesting things that we're having sellers say, it's my market and here's what I want. Does that mean that some buyers are like, that's great for you, not good for me? Absolutely. But those are just some of the examples, the more common ones that we've been kind of fielding through the hotline over the course of the last several months. In addition, we have resources for you. We have a couple of different articles. We have from our Wisconsin Real Estate Magazine, May 2021 and June 2021. We have the home inspection in a competitive market is in May. And then we have in June, what's going on, training tips for the current market. I believe, Jennifer, you might have written both those articles.
Yeah. And the training tips kind of jumps around a little bit to some just looking at what some of the trends are and how we can work through them and make sure that agents are practicing in a way that is safe regardless of what the parties are asking them to do. And in terms of just following up with these restrictions, the seller restrictions, I think it goes without saying, we probably don't need to say it, but a seller can't use these for housing discrimination. So they can't restrict and say, no women with children, or whatever their thing is. That probably don't need to say it, but I just want to remind people that even if a seller is saying, I want to restrict access or whatever in this way, we have to gently tell the seller, you can't do that. That's fair housing discrimination.
In one of the little ways, if you haven't had that experience where the seller kind of says to you, I really just don't, not really a big fan of this, or I'd really like to have a person that's in this, like this group, or I'd really like to have children, whatever it is that are part of the purchase of my home. It's always nice and polite to just go back to your listing contract and remind them of what that fair housing language looks like. So it's a little bit more like, hey, by the way, I'm not telling you to be a good person, that this is also the law. So it's kind of you not admonishing them as much as just educating them and reminding them of what that section of the contract was that they signed earlier. And so it's maybe a little awkward, but I think it always goes, when Jennifer says it goes without saying, it always goes with saying in some regard, right? She's like, it doesn't, we probably don't have to say this, but we're going to. When it comes to fair housing, we're always going to emphasize it. But we are also always here for you on Sundays from 1 to 4:30 p.m. The legal hotline is available for you. You work on Sundays, so do we. So if you have questions, concerns, or comments relating to your real estate transaction, that's what we're here for. So we encourage you to give us a call, give us an email, whatever the easiest way is for you. And Jennifer always likes to remind you that if you don't want to call back on Sunday, let us know, because that's an important thing. We don't want to interrupt your Sunday if that's not what you want.
And when you put your call in, you can say, please email me back. Or when you leave your voicemail, you say an email is fine. So if you don't want us ringing you up and disrupting your Sunday afternoon, or you say, I'd love to talk to you, please give me a call and we'll chat up about whatever your hotline question is.
That wraps up episode 18 of our Being Competitive mini-series. We thank you so much. If this was the final episode you watched or the first episode you watched, thank you for watching. And we're always here for you. And we will see you soon.
Yep. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Good. I want to just follow up with that. These mini-series videos are excellent, especially in this competitive market. They are covering the topics of multiple offers coming in, how to deal with them, love letters. There's a certain segment just on love letters, sight unseen offers, no inspection offers, no financing offers. So they do a complete video on each of those topics, as well as this last one, which is sort of a general seller conditions. So I hope you got something out of it, and I hope it leads you to go to the WRA.org, and you can click on any one of these videos and watch them at your own pace. I wanted to introduce them today so that at least we had some more of our agents aware of this resource that's here for you. I think one of the biggest takeouts from this video was follow up on what Charlie Stalley said about Keller Williams policy on if you say all offers are to be reviewed by a certain date. If you have that, number one, it should be in your listing contract, and number two, it should be in the private remarks in MLS, but it should also add seller reserves the right to accept an offer prior to this date. And I think that it's sort of balancing the fence this way. But as Corey and Jennifer brought up, there are going to be buyers that will write binding acceptance to be earlier than the date that's set in MLS. So the seller's put under pressure. Do I accept this beautiful offer, cash, no contingencies, whatever, but it comes the day before I said I was going to review all offers. We can't prevent the seller from accepting that or from breaking his own rule or things like that. So we have to follow our rules, but we can't tell a seller what he can do and what he can't do since it's his property in his house. So to give that, I think they covered that very well in this video, and it's something that we've been battling heads on quite a bit during this market. Any questions from you? Thank you for hanging in there.
I have one quick question. So a seller down the street from me, it was Firefly, put a sign up, and I had some buyers, so I wanted to inquire about it. It wasn't on the MLS yet, and it was stayed that way for like a day or maybe a day and a half or 2 days. And then I emailed her and she gave me some very basic information about the house. And then another agent said, oh yeah, Firefly does that in order to try and get a pocket listing or, you know, get both sides of the sale before it hits the MLS. So what are your thoughts about that? Do we have a policy about that? It just seems kind of slightly unethical to me.
Well, in some of the discussions that we had with MLS, Chris especially, companies like that are actually probably putting them in an excluded from MLS. So it doesn't show up on MLS, and MLS no longer publishes the addresses of excluded properties. So you don't know, but if there's a sign and no other marketing of any kind, and you can't find any trace of it in MLS, most likely it's excluded. Because for a company to do that without a signed listing contract and putting it in MLS, that's a big violation. So I don't think Firefly is doing anything wrong in this. I think they are just listing them as they are excluded properties. So they're listed but not marketed in MLS. Now I'm giving them the benefit of the doubt, and I think that's something that we have to do with most suspicious situations, is give the listing agent the benefit of the doubt or call the listing agent. If you really do see a violation, I would call MLS and refer it. Steph, do you have any comments?
I did just want to ask again, did it have a sign in the yard?
Yep, there was a sign. The sign's still there. It was like, 2 months ago. But it eventually went in MLS.
Yeah, they can have a sign if it's excluded. Excluded from MLS just means it can't be marketed out of MLS. They cannot market it though in any other way. They can't put it on social media or anything like that. If they do, they're breaking the Clear Cooperation Act and have to make it active within 24 hours. So the sign may be a violation of the Clear Cooperation Act, but I just know that they cannot market it in any written vehicle.
But also just want to echo the need and importance of giving everyone the benefit of the doubt, because I feel like it's really easy to quickly assume the worst, and that, we want to be kind to one another in this market. So, but yeah, just report those things if you feel like there's a question about them. So,
Thanks.
yeah.
Yeah, MLS has been very good. I'm sure their call center is swamped, but they've been very responsive when people call and ask questions about situations, or even if an agent calls in and says, I don't think something's, I don't think this is correct what they're doing. It's always good to check first instead of talking about it.
Any other questions? Any just general questions? Not even related to the topic? Okay.
Okay. Amy, have you gone in and looked at any of those other videos?
Not yet.
Okay. Dawn, I'd encourage that too if you're curious. They really are good. They're all under half an hour, and we're not gonna do one every Monday, but I thought this was a good one talking about seller responsibilities.
What did you say that website was?
I
It's
put it in the chat.
Pardon?
Oh, okay.
I just put it.
WRA.org.
Yep.
Or go ahead.
So I put the WRA's YouTube channel into the chat section.
Okay.
You'll be able to find them, and it's
Yeah.
competitive market mini series.
Okay.
What are there, like eight sessions? I think?
Yeah. There were 8 total. So,
All right, well, if there are no other questions, we're here to help. If you get caught in a specific situation, make sure that you call Steph or me. We're happy to help.
Thank
and
you.
Thank you both.
Thank you guys.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.